In the late 1800s, London detectives were desperately trying to track down the notorious Jack the Ripper when another serial killer seemed to begin to terrorize the city. Although the victims were similar, the killer's MO was totally different, and while the real name of Jack the Ripper has never been revealed, the Lambeth Poisoner was identified as a person who had sworn to do no harm. Dr. Thomas Cream. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank this episode's sponsor, Sterling Pacific. Sterling Pacific are producers of ultra-premium luggage for pilots and frequent flyers. Made from 5052 and reinforced A380 aluminium, along with Italian leather accents, the tough and lightweight design harks back to a stylish bygone era. I was lucky enough to be sent one out, and I must say, I was extremely impressed. The case glides along, but is rugged enough to protect your most precious items. While Sterling Pacific's luggage may not be the most affordable option out there, it offers something unique for those who aren't willing to compromise on their luggage. To make it more accessible, Sterling Pacific has provided my audience with a special offer. By using the code NEVER when making a purchase at sterlingpacific.com/never, you can save $300 and also help support the channel. So simply head to sterlingpacific.com/never to get your discount now. Born on May the 27th, 1850 in Glasgow, Scotland, Thomas Cream was raised in Quebec, Canada. There, his father became the manager of a thriving lumber and shipbuilding business. During his youth, it seemed Thomas would follow in his father's footsteps, but he felt his future lay elsewhere, and in 1872 he enrolled at the prestigious McGill University in Montreal. He was said to be a good student, but was also known for being a flashy dresser, making the most of his father's newfound wealth. Cream graduated in 1876, his thesis being on the effects of chloroform. He also gave an address to his fellow students titled "The Evils of Malpractice in the Medical Profession." Soon after, he left for England to continue his education and escape responsibilities. You see, Thomas had recently married a woman named Flora Brooks, who had fallen pregnant with his child. Cream, however, had no plans of fulfilling his role as a father or husband, so he attempted to perform an illegal abortion, which failed but left Flora terribly ill. After this, he tried to run away, but was caught by Flora's father and strong-armed into returning and marrying her. The day after the wedding, Cream left to continue his medical studies in London and Edinburgh. It's unclear whether he promised to return, but he would never see Flora or her family again. By the time he obtained qualifications as a physician and surgeon in 1878, Flora Brooks had died of tuberculosis, though there are claims she fell ill after taking medicines sent to her by Cream. Following his wife's death, Thomas returned to Canada and established a medical practice in London, Ontario, despite the fact he didn't have a license to practice in the province. That alone caused problems, but it was the death of Thomas's patient and alleged mistress, Catherine Hutchison Gardner, in 1879 that brought him to the attention of the authorities. Catherine was found dead in a privy behind the surgery at 204 Dundas Street soon after she had consulted Thomas about an abortion. Medical examination revealed Catherine had died of an overdose of chloroform. Cream claimed Catherine had written a letter in which she named a local businessman as the father of her child. He also said the young woman had been suicidal following his refusal to perform the abortion. But there was one big problem in this theory. A person cannot hold a chloroform-soaked cloth over their face long enough to cause death. But despite the inconsistencies and the fact that Catherine's handwriting and her signature were forged, the police didn't investigate the death any further. Having potentially dodged a bullet and with his reputation in tatters, Thomas decided it was time to leave Canada and relocate to the United States. Once there, he again set up a shady medical practice, this time in Chicago's red light district, a prime location for a doctor who was willing to perform illegal abortions. Despite his chosen line of work, Cream had a bizarre relationship with women he saw as immoral. While he's said to have regularly carried pornographic photographs around with him, he was also often heard talking about the women in terms far from agreeable. The police seemingly knew what went on inside his practice, but for the most part turned a blind eye. However, wherever Thomas Cream went, it seemed that death followed. In August 1880, the body of Mary Ann Faulkner was found in his assistant's apartment at Madison Street. Although it was suspected Mary had died after Thomas operated on her, no charges were filed due to lack of evidence. A few months later, in December 1880, Cream tried to place the blame for the death of another patient, Miss Stack, on a local pharmacist, claiming he had mixed up her prescription. He would use this accusation to attempt to extort money from the man. Once again, there were no consequences for Dr. Cream. That was until the death of Daniel Stott the following year. It was initially thought Daniel had simply died of an epileptic seizure in his home in Boone County, Illinois, but that wasn't the case. The 61-year-old Stott had been sending his 33-year-old wife, Julia, to collect pills from Thomas, which he marketed as a cure for epilepsy. It's claimed that the devious doctor began an affair with the woman, convincing her to take out life assurance on her husband before plying him with poisonous pills he'd supply. Stott died within moments of taking what he thought was medication. It could have ended there with Cream and Julia sharing the insurance money, but Thomas planned to blame a chemist for the death, suing them on Julia's behalf and claiming more cash. Thomas contacted the coroner, letting him know of his theory. The coroner ignored the claims, but with his suspicions raised, he asked the district attorney to exhume Daniel's body. When his body was re-examined, they found enough strychnine in his system to kill 3 people. Instead of the chemist, suspicion immediately fell upon Cream and his lover, with Julia eventually testifying as a witness against her partner in crime in exchange for immunity from being prosecuted. Thomas Cream was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in Joliet Prison. Despite being sentenced to life, Thomas would be released just under 10 years later in July 1891, when Governor Joseph W. Fife commuted his sentence after Cream's brother Daniel pleaded for leniency. Some claim he had bribed the governor. During his time inside, Thomas's father had passed away and left his son a large inheritance. Using this, he crossed the Atlantic to Liverpool before travelling to the other London, staying for a time at a fancy hotel on Fleet Street before eventually taking lodgings at 103 Lambeth Palace Road. Despite his time spent incarcerated, it didn't take long for Dr. Cream to fall back into his murderous ways. It's said that over the years, Cream would often dip into his supply of drugs and medication to self-medicate. This led to him developing an addiction to concoctions containing cocaine and morphine, which only grew worse during his time in prison. His hatred of women he saw as immoral also increased, and within 2 weeks of moving to London, 2 sex workers, Ellen Nellie Donworth and Matilda Clover, died after mysteriously falling ill. On October the 13th, 19-year-old Nellie was spotted with a gentleman at a local pub. Later, she was seen by a friend alone at Morpeth Place, barely able to stand. The friend assumed she was drunk, but upon getting home, Nellie began convulsing. A doctor was fetched who quickly diagnosed her with system poisoning. She was rushed to hospital but sadly died before arriving. A post-mortem would reveal a large amount of strychnine in her system. As with previous victims, and despite now having his inheritance, Cream attempted to use the death to make money, writing to the coroner using the pseudonym A. O'Brien and offering to name the killer in return for £3,000. He also wrote to William Frederick Smith, owner of W.H. Smith, accusing him of the murder and asking for cash to keep his silence. A week after Nellie's death, Thomas met Matilda Clover. She was a woman who had fallen on hard times after being deserted by her partner, leaving her to raise their child alone. With few ways out of her situation, she turned to drink and sex work, with Thomas becoming a regular visitor. During these encounters, he used another alias, Fred, and on October 20th, he paid a visit to her home at 27 Lambeth Street. She shared this residence with her son, the landlords Mr. and Mrs. Vowles, and their maid, Lucy Rose. At 9 p.m, she returned after a night out with Fred in tow. The pair went to Matilda's room where they began drinking. Before leaving, he gave the woman 4 pills and told her to take them before bed. Early the next morning, screams of pain rang through the house. The Vowles and their maid burst into Matilda's room to find her convulsing in pain. She would die before a doctor could arrive. Her death was initially believed to be caused by her consuming alcohol, along with sedatives prescribed by her physician. Once again, Cream attempted to use the murder to extort money, this time contacting Sir William Broadbent, claiming he held evidence against him. Broadbent contacted the police, who set a trap for the blackmailer, though no one was captured. While he murdered sex workers by night, by day, Thomas Cream wooed a lady named Laura Sabatini. The pair had met during Cream's excursions to Hertfordshire, and their relationship moved quickly, with the doctor spending weekends with Sabatini's family and even attending church with them. A proposal soon ensued, with Laura accepting. Before their wedding could take place, however, Thomas was called back to Canada for the final disbursement of his late father's funds. On January 7, 1892, he bid his fiancée farewell, and for several months the streets of Victorian London were free of at least one serial killer. However, by April he had returned to his address at 103 Lambeth Palace Road and once again set about his murderous quest. He met a woman named Louise Harvey, née Harris, near St. James's Hall, and introduced himself as Dr. Thomas Neill. After procuring her services, Cream pressed her for more information about herself. Wary about her new companion, Louise fed him a string of lies, but agreed to meet him later for a drink, with him telling her he would bring with him some pills that would clear up her complexion. They met as planned, but when Cream urged her to take the pills, she only pretended to. However, believing that she had taken them, Thomas made his excuses and left. He may have been surprised not to hear of Louise's death in the coming days if he had not been busy with his next victims. On April 11th, he met 2 women, 21-year-old Alice Marsh and 18-year-old Emma Shrivel. He escorted the women home, where they spent the night having sex and drinking heavily. Afterwards, he gave the women 3 pills each, telling them it would prevent sexually transmitted diseases, and at 2 a.m. he left. Moments later, the same tragic scene played out as it had done with Cream's previous victims, as the 2 women thrashed around in pain, their fates sealed. Strychnine was once again found in their system, and the police, along with the newspapers, now knew they had a serial poisoner on their hands. Once again, however, Cream was the architect of his own downfall. At the beginning of May, Deputy Coroner George Percival, who was overseeing the inquest into the latest murders, received a letter claiming a Dr. Walter Harper of St. Thomas Hospital was behind the killings. Harper himself also received a letter, this one stating that his son was behind the killings. Again, it asked for a sum of money for the writer to keep his silence. Both letters were signed William H. Murray. The Harpers immediately contacted the police, who soon linked the latest letters to other accusatory correspondence. Among those from A. O'Brien and William Murray were letters from an M. Malone seeking money to keep quiet about the death of Matilda Clover. This perplexed investigators, who believed her death to have been caused by her own hand. A handwriting expert would state that the letters were likely written by the same person. But who? Cream's next mistake would seal his fate. Far from keeping a low profile, he continued to flit about London, socialising and looking for victims. During one such trip, he began talking to a man named John Heinous. Heinous was a former detective from New York, and with papers filled with stories of the Lambeth Poisoner, the conversation soon turned to the two men's theories on the case. John was surprised about the level of detail Cream gleefully shared with him. He revealed locations, addresses and names, including those of Matilda Clover and even Louise Harvey, who was very much alive. When pressed on how he knew so much about the subject, Cream stated he had read the victim's post-mortem reports in the British Medical Journal. Heinous didn't buy it, but he didn't let on. Instead, the next day, he contacted a friend who worked at Scotland Yard and informed him about the man he had met. An investigation into the doctor soon began, with police quickly discovering that his name was not Thomas Neill, as he proclaimed, but Thomas Neill Cream, and he had a history in the United States and Canada before travelling to England. Slowly, the net began to close around Dr. Cream. Police were sent to tell him wherever he went. Matilda Clover's body was exhumed and found to contain strychnine, and detectives learned of his prison time for murder in Chicago. A sample of his handwriting was also appropriated, and on June 3, 1892, he was arrested, initially on charges of blackmail. He wrote to his fiancée telling her that he was innocent, but the evidence against him steadily began to grow, culminating in signed receipts for large amounts of strychnine, and most damning of all, the testimony of Louise Harvey, whom to that point Cream had believed dead. Her words soon saw Cream charged with the murder of the four women. His trial took place over several days from October 17th to the 21st, and while the prosecution called forth several witnesses, the defence didn't have any, and as he was charged with a capital crime, Cream was unable to testify in his own defence. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it took the jury just 12 minutes to find Cream guilty, with Judge Henry Hawkins sentencing Thomas Neill Cream to death. On the morning of November 15th, 1892, thousands of people waited outside Newgate Prison. Although they wouldn't get to witness the sentence being carried out, their cheers would have carried over the walls to Cream's ears. His hangman that day was a Mr. James Billington, and while Cream is said to have been silent during his walk to the scaffold, Billington claims that in the split second before he plunged to his doom, Cream uttered the words, "I am Jack." Billington claims that he meant Jack the Ripper, though many doubt he was, or that he said these words at all. Theories range from Billington making up the story as he wanted the distinction of being the man who had hanged the Ripper, to those from one of Cream's biographers who believed the doctor actually said, "I am ejaculating." Whatever he may have said, or not said, many others have made links between Cream and the Ripper, And while the doctor was in prison during Jack's murders in 1888, some claim he had actually been free by then, either due to his brother's bribes or a lookalike taking his place. However, while their victims may have had a lot in common, the fashion in which they committed their crimes was vastly different. But what do you think? Could Cream have also been the Ripper? Let us know in the comments below. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.